Hi, good morning. My name is Verna Barrientos, and I will be your worship associate for today's UUCC Community Service. Welcome, everyone. If you're here for the first time, if you're curious about our faith, or if you've been here before, or are a longtime member, welcome. Good to see you today. All are welcome, whether or not you believe in God or a higher source, hold to humanist or secular teachings, if you come from another religion, or if you've always been Unitarian Universalist, you are welcome here. The UUCC community welcomes all people of all skin tones, the LGBTQ+ community, kids and mature folks, those with life challenges, and those temporarily without such challenges. For here we are, working to overcome our society's systemic biases, and you specifically are most welcome here today. Our beloved Kai Marx returned to talk with us on I'm familiar with the works of Pablo Neruda, The Care and Keeping of Your Soul. For those Bart Simpson fans, you may recognize this line from the Simpsons episode in which Bart sells his soul for $5. Kai affirms our soul is sacred. So, how do we go about caring for the soul without feeling as if we've lost or sold it? Today, Kai will explore ways to connect with our soul in our everyday lives, and ultimately to discover the best in ourselves and in each other. After the service today, we hope you stay on Zoom to join our usual random smallish breakout groups that give us a chance to discuss thoughts from today's service. And now our opening hymn this morning, Abide With Me, which is number 101 in the UU hymnal and is sung today by our own UUCC choir. In light of today's theme, we could ask ourselves, who is this hymn addressed to? Could it be our own soul? So please rise in body and or spirit, sing along, or just listen to this beautiful classic hymn, Abide With Me.
Good morning. The match, the spark, our chalice flame. Now please join us in reading the chalice lighting words by John O'Donohue from To Bless the Space Between Us. Once you awaken to your soul, you know that you are no longer alone, nor are you at the mercy of your own frailty and limitation. Awakening to your soul, you begin to learn another way of being in the world. The old barriers no longer confine you. The old wounds no longer name you, and the old fears no longer claim you. Now, Verna will lead us in sharing our joys and concerns.
Thank you, Dave. In a moment, we'll play a video where Bill invites us to share our joys and concerns. While the video is playing, please feel free to share your joys and concerns using the chat window and to read on your own what is shared there by others. And just to remind you, for upcoming services, if you have any joys or concerns that you would specifically like the worship associate to read aloud, please email us prior to the service.
One of the ways we create our beloved community is by sharing our own joys and our concerns with one another and finding support from our community. At this time, we invite you to click the chat button at the bottom middle of your Zoom window. That brings up a window in which you can type any joys or concerns. As you do so, we will hear Vera Vandershock play La Grima by Francisco Tárrega. In these times of reflection and renewal, let us remember that it remains important to reach out to one another when we feel the need, and to accept being reached out to. May we find comfort in knowing that we can share our joys and our concerns here among us.
May we hold with love and care the joys and concerns that have been shared publicly today, as well as those that remain unspoken in the recesses of our hearts. Before I introduce our guest speaker, Tom has a reading for us.
This reading is from Mary Oliver. The late Mary Oliver is one of the most beloved poets of our time. She was profoundly interested in philosophical and even theological questions, but her poems are so grounded in her careful observation of the natural world that they're never abstract, but always speak directly and simply to the deep issues of life. This poem is called Bone. Understand, I am always trying to figure out what the soul is, and where hidden, and what shape. And so last week, when I found on the beach the ear bone of a pilot whale that may have died hundreds of years ago, I thought maybe I was close to discovering something. For the ear bone is the portion that lasts longest in any of us, man or whale, shaped like a squat spoon with a pink scoop where once in the lively swimmer's head, it joined its two sisters in the house of hearing. It was only 2 inches long, and thought the soul might be like this, so hard, so necessary, yet almost nothing. Beside me, the gray sea was opening and shutting its wave doors, unfolding over and over its time-ridiculing roar. I looked, but I couldn't see anything through its dark-knit glare. Yet, don't we all know, the golden sand is there at the bottom, though our eyes have never seen it, nor can our hands ever catch it, lest we would sift it down into fractions and facts, certainties. And what the soul is also, I believe I will never quite know. Though I play at the edges of knowing, truly I know our part is not knowing, but looking and touching and loving, which is the way I walked on softly through the pale pink morning light. And now, Verna will introduce our guest speaker.
Now, with great pleasure, I get to introduce our worship leader today. Kai Marks is a writer, teacher, and spiritual director who is also a member of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Redwood City. Kai is a graduate of the Caroline Myss Education Institute programs, both in archetypes and in mysticism. She is also a graduate of the Disney Institute program for excellence in leadership. Kai holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of San Francisco, and she currently serves as the head of school for Fusion Academy, Palo Alto. She dearly loves the UUCC community and is deeply honored to be a part of this worship service today. Welcome, Kai.
Thank you so much, Verna. Good morning. It is a pleasure to be with you all again today. This is absolutely one of my favorite communities. You all are so much fun to work with and have such diligence and care for all parts of the service. As mentioned earlier, this service title comes from what is perhaps an unlikely place, an episode of The Simpsons. If you're like me and you've grown up watching The Simpsons for the last 32 years, then it's likely you've heard someone use the expression, "I'm familiar with the works of Pablo Neruda." And when the person says this, what they mean is, yes, it's obvious, or yes, everyone knows that, because that is the way Bart means this when he says this to his sister Lisa in the episode wherein Bart sells his soul for $5. Bart sells his soul to his best friend for $5, believing that there is no such thing as a soul, and believing that he has a greater need in the short term for a bit of cash. To prove to everyone that he's right, Bart takes out a piece of paper, writes Bart Simpson's soul on it, and sells it, confident that he has outwitted his friend and made a handy profit. But almost immediately, curious things begin to happen to him. More on this a bit later. I suspect this episode resonates with so many people because many of us have asked the same questions as Bart does. We've wondered if the soul is real. Perhaps we've even dismissed it or asked it to take a back seat to our own financial needs or our needs for security in the physical world. So what is the soul anyway? For our purposes today, it may be helpful to think of ourselves as having three aspects simultaneously. We have an ego, we have a spirit, and we have a soul. And we move back and forth through these parts of ourselves many times in a single day. Simply put, there's the ego that manages our identity and works hard to keep us safe in the physical world and keeps careful track of our history. There's our spirit or self that helps to keep us aware of how we're feeling and experiencing things in the present moment. And then there's our soul, the even deeper part of us that connects us to eternity. For example, the ego might ask you, what do I need? The spirit or self might ask, what do I want? And the soul asks, to what am I being called? For what reasons was I born? What is my greater purpose? And although we may have questions about the role of the soul in our lives, we instinctively know that the soul is there. And popular culture knows this. Many of you are likely familiar with the recent Pixar film Soul, or remember the countless references to soul in literature and music. Now, as an aside, I will tell you, I don't know if it is still this way, but back in the day when I was a graduate fiction student, the one thing that could cause you to get the most ostracism and derision was to use the word soul. And the reason that that was such a sin at that time in fictional circles was the idea was if you did that, that you were reaching for something greater that you didn't have the words for. And when we come to talk about the soul, that's hard to do because it's a big thing. And it's something that we all have different experiences of. So very often what happens when we hit the high altitude spiritually is there's a need to go into metaphor. And there's a need to talk about the qualities of it as we explore and get closer to what that ineffable thing actually is. Now, this is even more of a challenge because our culture tends not to talk much about the soul. In fact, if you bring that up too soon in an interaction, you might risk making people uncomfortable. It's unfortunate that we don't talk about the soul because what we find is the soul has its own vocabulary. If you sit down to talk with someone about something that's important to your soul, you're not having small talk over lunch. If you've reached the realm of the soul, you've hit some of life's most important questions, and the soul cares very much about our level of honesty, integrity, how our values operate. And it takes time even to be able to begin the vocabulary for that dialogue. And it takes time to find the people who can have those conversations with you. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the first step toward caring for your soul is acknowledging that you do indeed have one. And so it also helps to recognize and use the vocabulary that comes with it, because the soul asks the deep and awe-inspiring questions. And sometimes these questions can be frightening, especially if we don't feel ready for the answers, or we feel like we're living in a way that is not in alignment with those answers, because the soul asks all of the questions that set change and transformation in motion. Because we have so many questions, and as Unitarians, we often have more questions than most, we often depend on others, like Mary Oliver, to tell us about our own souls. While contemplation and exploration are important, these are most effective when we give ourselves permission to talk openly for ourselves in safe settings about how we experience our soul communicating with us, so that we gradually become more familiar with our own soul and with that quality that abides with us. The soul also thrives in an atmosphere of truth, and we tend to feel at one with our soul when we feel at one with ourselves, when our mind and heart are in alignment with each other. The soul also thrives in an atmosphere of creativity, and neither of these things might surprise you, but here's another one that might. One of the things the soul needs most to thrive is periods of quiet. To better understand this, let's consider the opposite. A person might have a harder time establishing a relationship with the soul in an environment that is filled with distractions. I'll tell you now, one of the mortal enemies of finding time to be with your soul are these little beauties, these little boxes of distraction. Wonderful though they are not necessarily our friends when it comes to finding quiet time and connecting with our soul, because literal or metaphorical noise can tend to drown out that still small voice. And if we're wrestling with something deeper, or having a difficult time facing a truth about ourselves or our lives, we may even nurture those distractions to keep from hearing what our soul is trying to tell us. If this goes on too long, or if our soul is left unattended for some time, we may begin to actually feel soul sick. Not long after Bart sells his soul, for example, he begins to experience a kind of emptiness, a loneliness he can't quite define. His own dog and cat become frightened of him. Automatic doors stop opening for him. And the things that used to bring him joy, like spitting from an overpass, no longer do. I suspect that many of us suffer from varying degrees of feeling soul sick without even knowing that that's what it is, because we don't talk about it enough. Or when it happens, we call it something else, something that we might consider more socially acceptable, like depression or boredom. We haven't given ourselves adequate time to develop a soul vocabulary, and we often don't give ourselves enough time and space for quiet. True soul companions are those friends who can be trusted to bear witness to the deepest parts of our lives, and these can be difficult to find. We may start to feel like we are disconnected from the things we once loved, and we may sense that doors are no longer opening for us. So what then can be done? Although we may laugh at Bart's decision to sell his soul for $5, the truth is that selling your soul is a common expression in our culture, because we recognize the places in our lives where we ourselves or where others we love have done this. Regret often comes after we've compromised when we or our soul knew better, or when we negotiated something precious to us for safety or security, or for the sake of maintaining a relationship to another person. I've heard it said that if you're miserable in your job, but you stay in it anyway, you should look at your pay stub, because it will tell you the exact price you've placed on your own soul. And I'll share with you an example this week, and I wish it weren't such a common example, but a lovely person wrote to me a very poignant email about how frustrated she is with how heavy her work life is, and she noticed that she's beginning to have small meltdowns from time to time because her life is just too full and the deadline's too intense. And I resonate with that because I've often written emails to people like that myself. Let me make that clear. This is not something that I also don't wrestle with. But as I was reading through this and listening to her catalog, the kinds of things that are going on, the spiritual director in me read 2 pages of this and thought, you know what's going on. She feels disconnected from her soul. And instantly I know that. We don't live in a culture where people can just say that. So we begin to unpack these kinds of things back and forth. And sure enough, that's the place that we come. And so when you feel that in yourself, that kind of overload that begins to cause you to lose your joy or to behave in ways that you yourself don't recognize, I highly recommend taking that seriously and knowing that that's real. It's one of the reasons I love the work that I do, both as a head of school, but more so as a spiritual director. I tend to think of my career in the physical world as like my Clark Kent, but my life as a spiritual director is where things really get exciting, and that's where my superpower is. I've thought about putting on a business card, Soul Conduit, because that's part of what I get to do, is help people reconnect with what's already there. Now, of course, you throw that word around a little bit and somebody's going to say to you, just like they do with the soul, is that even a real thing? And I'm like, oh, you have no idea. Right? So finding the people that can help you reconnect, always a good thing. And the good news is that our soul abides with us. It's always there. Now, sometimes we may not always want that. I mean, we may not always want that subtle but persistent reminder of where we're really meant to be. But it's there, whether we choose to be aware of it or not. And usually things go better for us if we do choose to be aware of it. Just as we would care for any living thing we love, there are some things we can do to maintain or to recover our relationship with our soul. So here are some of them. This is by no means an exhaustive list. I'm going to recommend that if this is something you're interested in doing, you have a daily, and dare I say it, spiritual practice. And I will also say to start small. Even 2 minutes or 5 minutes per day is more than enough time to set transformation in motion. Why? Because the soul is timeless. It both has eternity and has no time simultaneously. So no act in your own favor is too small. I recommend taking this time for silence and for listening to your still small voice. If you're comfortable doing so, you might consider adding journaling, reading sacred text. I've heard it said that for Jewish people, the Old Testament is sacred text. For Christians, it's the New Testament. And for Unitarians, the third book in the canon is the collected works of Mary Oliver. Any of those will work, as will meditation or even prayer if you're so inclined. And there are many other verbs ending in ing, meaning that you do them over time, that will work as a spiritual practice. I recommend also that you seek truth and practice honesty with yourself and with others. This is how you begin to make yourself one and make yourself whole and holy. If you feel like you're already doing that, challenge yourself to see if you can go a layer deeper or to be even more consistent with that. Because that's how you align your head with your heart. Seek out moments of awe. That would be AWE, the good kind that make you feel inspired, that connect you to something bigger, not the other kind that happens so often that end just in AW, like the awe of disappointment. No, go for the other kind. Go for those moments of awe. Consider getting yourself a spiritual director, someone who's trained to help you recognize and validate your own spiritual experiences and growth. This is sometimes called, in other circles, taking a long, loving look at the real. Or seek out soul companions and make time for meaningful conversation. We all need safe and inspiring people to bear witness to the events of our lives and to help us find the spiritual meaning in them. Reduce or eliminate distractions. And always choose faith over fear. A good question to ask ourselves is, what do we follow? And here's another way to think of the different parts of ourselves. Think for a moment about social media. Our ego might care very much about how many followers we have, but our soul could not care less. The soul asks instead, what do you follow? Do you follow others' approval? Do you follow fear? Or do you follow faith? Do you follow the sound of the still small voice of the soul that subtly but constantly calls you toward peace and toward a greater purpose? In addition to calling us toward our destiny, our soul calls us toward the actions we need to take to heal ourselves. And while it may seem like everyone wants to heal, the truth is that human beings are the only creatures capable of and who sometimes choose to block our own healing. And sometimes that's because healing can be intimidating. It requires us to change in ways that at least some parts of us find frightening. Or sometimes the decision to heal requires an act of forgiveness that may be difficult. But at the top of your order of service today, if you saw it, is a quote from Carolyn Mace: the soul always knows what to do to heal itself. The challenge is to silence the mind. Because the soul is connected to eternity, it has an inherent quality of patience, and its signals tend to be more subtle and also more persistent. Now, if you're driving down the freeway and you get a little too close and you're risking being in an accident, that signal is very loud. That signal is not your soul. The ego, that fear voice, is the voice that will keep you up at night. Your soul is much more polite and subtle because it's not in a hurry. Your soul tends to talk to you like this, a little bit softer, which means it's very easy not to hear it if you don't want to. But if you make time for quiet and for contemplative conversation, you'll always hear what your soul has to say because it's always there. The challenge is, in part, to listen when we might otherwise be tempted to give in to our distractions. It's worth noting, too, that just as often we can be the ones to help someone else to heal and recover their soul. Think back to a time when someone reminded you of who you really are, or reminded you of the best part of yourself, or of the deepest desires of your heart, or said something that allowed you to come home to yourself. We can almost always find a way to do this for another person, and it's often easier to do this for someone else when we're first starting out on the spiritual journey. You might remember the lyrics from the Anne Murray song, "You Needed Me." I remember in the middle of that song, one of the lines, "I sold my soul and you bought it back for me." I remember the first time I heard that line, I was 5 years old, riding home from kindergarten and having some idea that that must be really important, that that must be something special you could do for somebody. I didn't understand it then, but it stayed with me. And I've continued to notice that that expression comes up a lot. And it wouldn't be there if there weren't a truth to that. We can sell things out for ourselves, and sometimes we buy them back. And sometimes we are just blessed because someone, maybe even someone we don't know well, has the grace to see that and to buy it back for us. If we've lost our connection to our own soul, or perhaps if we have not yet cultivated a relationship with it, even for the first time, well, once again, we can learn from Bart Simpson. Gradually, after becoming more and more miserable, he realizes that he's indeed sold more than a piece of paper. And he decides he wants his soul back. So he sets out to find the paper, but to no avail. And finally, in an ultimate act of surrender, he drops to his knees and he prays. He forms his own connection with the spiritual realm, saying, "I sure could use some of that good stuff right now." And not long after his prayer, he discovers that his own sister has found and bought his piece of paper back for him. Just as we can do for one another, she gives him back his piece of paper and his soul. Our soul is the voice of yes. Our soul is all that good stuff. While our interior fear will tell us no, what we can't do, why we should be afraid, why it's not possible, our soul is always the voice of yes. That's how you can recognize when it begins to talk to you. Think about a time when you've been at a crossroads and you wanted to make a decision. You might hear your soul whisper to you, "Hey, why don't you start by?" Or, "You know, you've always wanted to." And a split second later, maybe your ego delivered on your fears and reminded you of all your past experiences and your perceived failures. But your soul, ever patient, holds out the bigger picture to you. And yourself, the entity in the middle who has to make that decision in present time, will either hear that and act on it. If it feels right and good and you have the confidence to do that, that's very likely. But what is also likely in that moment, because it's intimidating to stand at that crossroads between faith and fear, that's when somebody will often buy time with something like Candy Crush, of which I have no judgment. It is a great stress reducer. I've completed 1,600 levels, but Candy Crush is not the way to your soul. What it is a fantastic arrow pointing to the fact that your soul is up to something. So when you find yourself distracting, hold yourself in great compassion and see if you can bring yourself away from that distraction and into a space where you can listen courageously. Because if you're able to say yes to the voice of your soul rather than drown it out, what you'll find is that although the soul requires us to face our fears and act with courage, it is the voice of yes. And the thing is, it gives us everything we need to get where we're going. It just doesn't tell us the answer. Sometimes the soul is like that parent from childhood when you would ask for something you really wanted and you'd get something like, we'll see, or soon. I can remember as a child hating that. And I will admit, having the same relationship to the soul, because it'll give you clues. It'll give you the breadcrumb trail. Sometimes it'll show you the end, but not the steps it takes to get there, because that's where faith comes in. And on that path, as much as we're getting to where we want to go, we're supposed to be continuing to grow and develop. So you're only going to get a little bit at a time, and watch what you do in response to that. It's really fun because the soul is so much more patient than we are. And part of that is that the soul doesn't have to pay rent. So it can afford that extra time. If you want to imagine what that voice of yes is like, I can give you a couple of other images that you may be familiar with. I think of James Joyce's Molly Bloom at the end. I will yes, and I will yes, and I will yes. Or more recently, perhaps, if you've seen the movie When Harry Met Sally, Sally's moment of yes. Think about that. If you are familiar with either of those things, that'll give you an idea of what your soul is like, cheering you on, just waiting for you to show up and listen. Learning to follow the voice of yes is about learning to follow the path of destiny, not just for ourselves, but also for the others that we meet along the path with us. And it requires having the faith that a rose is going to open. That's another metaphor you can think of. Everyone that comes is new. There's no guarantee of that, but we see that grow. We know it's going to open, and we know that it's going to be worth the wait. So what does all this have to do with us, and why is it important? The soul is our companion on the path to realizing our destiny, and the surest place not only to develop a lasting relationship with that deep eternal part of us that helps us to triumph in trying times, but also to hear the subtle whispers of the voice that calls us toward all that brings us joy and fulfillment, and asks us to use our creative gifts and toward all that we are meant to become. When we give attention to the care and keeping of our own soul, we open ourselves up to greater possibilities of yes. In the words of John O'Donohue from our chalice lighting this morning, a reminder that once you awaken to your soul, you know that you're no longer alone, nor are you at the mercy of your own frailty and limitations. Awakening to your soul, you begin to learn another way of being in the world. The old barriers no longer confine you, the old wounds no longer name you, and the old fears no longer claim you. Ultimately, whatever destiny looks like for each one of us, the path to purpose is the path to wholeness and to holiness. The phrase "we would be one" means to reclaim those fragments of ourselves, and we do this in part by pledging ourselves anew to that high cause of greater understanding, the greater understanding of who we are and what in us is true. And we can be sure that if we listen, the soul will always tell us what that is and what we need to do to heal ourselves. By searching for that meaning and by helping others to do the same, we can build a nobler world than the one we know today. We can build a world of the kind that binds our hearts and points us on our way. It takes time and dedication, and I believe it takes a spiritual practice, whatever form that takes for you, in order to reach the kind of awakening and freedom that John O'Donohue speaks about, and to cultivate a soul with courage and with stamina. So start small. Acknowledge your soul. Build a relationship with what has always abided with you. Listen to your soul and to the souls of others. If you do this, even just the littlest, tiniest bit every day, I can promise you, you'll accelerate your own healing. The quality of your relationships will improve, and you'll feel at one with yourself, as though you're coming back to the home you never really left, just like Dorothy after Oz. And then, when someone asks you if your soul is real, you can say with confidence, yes, I am familiar with the works of Pablo Neruda. Blessed be. Okay, I invite you now to reflect on what aspects of this service have spoken to you as we listen to Tom Devine sing hymn number 391 from the UU hymnal, Voice Still and Small.
Voice still and small, deep inside all, I hear you call, singing. In dark and rain, sorrow and pain, still you remain, singing. Calming my fears, quenching my tears, through all the years, singing.
That was beautiful. Thank you, Kai, for a fun and inspirational sermon. According to Psychology Today, generosity is the act of being kind, selfless, and giving to others. Despite being an act that is done to benefit others' well-being, generosity also paradoxically increases our well-being. So being generous is a fantastic way to improve your mental health and well-being. One of the ways that we practice generosity is by giving money to the Unitarian Universalist Coastside community. Another way to show your generosity is by sharing your skills and talents through volunteering. Lastly, by being here today, you are giving something very precious to our UU Coastside community, the gift of your time. Thank you for giving in whatever ways feel the most impactful to you. Your generosity is appreciated. As your generous spirit moves you today, please feel free to contribute what you can to UUCC, either by check or online. The instructions for giving are in today's order of service. While these collections take place, let us take a few moments to hear Linda Grace Frost and Laurel Frischman sing hymn number 396, I Know This Rose Will Open.
I know this rose will open. I know my fear will burn away. I know my soul will unfurl its wings. I know this rose will open. I know this rose will open. I know my fear will burn away. I know my soul will unfurl its wings. I know this rose will open. I know this rose will open. I know my fear will away. I know my soul will unfurl its wings. I know this rose will open.
Thank you, Linda Grace and Laurel, for your voices in that beautiful song and for all your songs. And now for some announcements. We want to thank UU San Mateo for administrative and professional support and allowing us to participate in the recent All Together Now auction. Please join us on June 20th for a Coast Pride video special preview of the first of a 7-part series featuring intergenerational interviews of an LGBTQ+ elder and youth. The entire series will air in October in honor of LGBTQ+ month. Coast Pride is currently looking for more participants for their series, recruiting both young adults and older adults for these interviews. Bruce Raffnell has produced this first episode for them, and we are thrilled to get the first peek. And now Dave will guide us in extinguishing the chalice.
Behold, The soulful flame has fulfilled its purpose. Now, please join me in reading these words by Elizabeth Selley-Jones. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Our closing hymn is We Would Be One, featuring Tom Devine on piano, Linda Grace Frost, and the UUCC Choir. John Sibelius wrote its melody, Finlandia, in 1899. In 1953, Unitarian minister Samuel Anthony Wright wrote these lyrics to celebrate the formation that year of the liberal religious youth of the United States and Canada. This foreshadowed the merger of the Unitarian and Universalist churches 8 years later. We would be one indeed. This seems so important to say today. Please rise in body and or spirit and add your voice, or just listen if you like, as we sing hymn number 318, We Would Be One.
We would be one, as now we join in singing our hymn of love, to pledge ourselves anew to that high cause of greater understanding of who we are and what in us is true. We would be one in living for each other, to show to all a new community. We would be one in building for tomorrow a nobler world than we have known today. We would be one in searching for that meaning which finds our hearts and points us on our way. As one we pledge ourselves to greater service, with love and justice strive to make us free.
Thanks to everyone who contributed to this wonderful and humorous service today. Thank you, Kai, for your inspirational words and wry humor. We also want to acknowledge our first Sunday production team, UUCC Music Director Tom Devine, and all the wonderful singers and musicians in today's service. Our chalice lighter, Dave Rakowski, Artistic Director, Noreen Cooper-Hevlin, and our session management engineer and video editor, Bruce Raffnell. We also want to acknowledge the beautiful music by Tom Devine and the UUCC Choir. And thanks to all of you for participating in this timely service. Immediately following the service, Bill will create some breakout rooms for us, which will serve as a safe space to talk openly and honestly about today's topic, or anything else that might be on our minds. Consider it kind of like the post-service coffee hour, without donuts or coffee, but feel free to bring your own. We hope you will join us in these breakout rooms, and please keep in mind that what is said here stays here, but thoughts and concepts we learn and are inspired by can most definitely be shared. Please be thoughtful of the time so that anyone who wishes to speak has the opportunity to do so. Here are some discussion points to consider. Can you describe a time when you felt particularly connected to your soul and or something greater than yourself? What inspires you? What's one thing you can do today to further enhance your connection to your own soul? In just a few moments, Bill will give everyone permission to unmute themselves. Have a very enjoyable and safe week.
I am familiar with the works of Pablo Neruda.